Good day, everyone. We've been looking at a kind of a critical analysis of the scientific creationist position. And in connection with that, you should have been reading and maybe have read several times the book on scientific creationism by Henry Morris. There are several ways to approach a subject, and sometimes the way I approach it might seem kind of backwards, but I think it's very helpful to have some critical tools to work with when you go into reading a book, at least somewhere in the back of your mind, so as you read the book you can see what the problem is. I have a kind of a personality that is pretty well persuaded when I read a book written by an intelligent person, and I stay persuaded till I read another book that is also written by an intelligent person that knocks holes in the first book. And you know, there are a lot of people like that. And so perhaps it's better to have a little of the critical view of a book before you read it, so that you can read it the first time and actually see some of the problems that might lie there. The scientific creationism, of course, is, as I've tried to indicate, is a modern movement that is a reaction to something else. And today we're going to talk about what that something else is that scientific creationism is a reaction to. I've tried to emphasize that scientific creationism, as we now know it, is not the traditional view of Christian biblical interpretation. It is a modern view. It may not be a modern view that appeals to you, and you may consider it to be very unmodern. But that's misunderstanding of modern. There are a lot of things that we call modern that all that means is that this is the particular period of time in history when these things arose. And so there are a lot of very conservative Christian and other positions, political positions and otherwise, that are not really traditional. They may be conservative, but they're not really traditional. They arise in the context of controversy, and scientific creationism is one of these. And as we get back into a look at the rise of biological science in the Darwinian form, we're getting back to one of our old standbys, and that is Ian Barber in his book Religion and Science, Historical and Contemporary Issues. This is a revision of some older work that Barber has done. He is my favorite synthesizer on this issue of science and religion. He is an older man. There are a lot of younger people who are coming along doing the same thing, and there are a lot of older people in Britain who have been doing the same thing and are still doing it. That is showing the relationship between science and religion in a more profound way than some Americans have been doing, because Americans just kind of went in the direction toward fundamentalism and modernism, and it was really in Britain that a great deal of the synthesizing continued to go on through the decades. But Ian Barber has just retired as the professor of physics and professor of religion and professor of science, technology, and society at Carleton College. And he is sometimes called the preeminent synthesist in the field. He's given the Gifford Lectures, which is one of the important British lectureships on the relation between science and theology, or between philosophy and theology. As Barber begins, during the 19th century, it was in biology that the scientific development occurred that undoubtedly had the most far-reaching impact on human thought, constituting one of the major revolutions in intellectual history. Now this is certainly true in terms of the so-called battle between science and religion. The battle between Galileo and the church was a skirmish compared to what was produced by the Darwinian revolution. But I also want to underline again what I've said all along, and that is there really was not that much of a battle between Christianity and science. The battle was among Christians about how science and the Bible should be related and how the Bible should be interpreted. And the same thing is true about the Darwinian revolution. If there had been no Christians, if there had been no Christians in this discussion, then Darwinianism would never have won its place in science, because almost all of the scientists at this time were Christians, and most of them were fairly traditional Christians. And so the struggle was not between a group of people who had arisen somehow out of nowhere, who were agnostics and atheists, who didn't believe in creation any longer, and so they had to figure out some other way to explain the existence of the world, and so they came up with evolution. That's not how it occurred. How it occurred was the theory of evolution grew up among Christian thinkers, as well as astronomy and geology and so forth. And Christians had been struggling, theologians, Bible scholars had been struggling already with astronomy, they'd been struggling already with geology, and they'd even been struggling with some previous attempts at theories of evolution. But when they struggled with these things, they were struggling with Christians. In geology, they were struggling with Charles Lyell, who was a traditional Christian. In astronomy, they were struggling with Galileo and Kepler and people like this who were traditional Christians. When they were struggling with physics, they were struggling with Newton, who would have been embarrassed out of his mind to think that people conceived of him as being intelligent in one area, that is science, and ignorant in another area, that is theology. But I also want to make a point here, and that is that even though biology has had the most far-reaching impact on human thought, it's not necessarily the most intense threat to traditional Christian thought among the sciences. For instance, more recent developments in psychology, sociology, and particularly the sociology of knowledge are even much more complex and threats to traditional Christian thought. And we're not going to be able to get too deeply into these areas, but if you intend to continue your study in the relationship between religion and science, you will learn that there are even more intense issues involved in the relationship between psychology and religion, sociology and religion, particularly the sociology of knowledge. Yes?
Did the divisions along the Christian scientists that were interested in evolution or supported it and opposed it tend to be along the same lines of those that took a more literalist interpretation of the Bible versus those that understood the symbolic nature?
No, that's another one of the ironies of the whole problem. The average layman in the Church of England who had no scientific or theological training would tend to be a literalist. You know, if you grow up a Christian, even if you study the Bible in Sunday school, and if you hear the Bible read every Sunday morning, if you're not introduced to any to ways of reading literature and so forth, you will tend to be a literalist. And so people out in the countryside tended to be literalistic in the Bible, just like they tended to be kind of fundamentalistic in all areas of their knowledge and understanding. But in science, Darwin had to present his theory to the best scientific minds alive. We're talking about the Royal Academy of Science, and these people were not nincompoops. Without them, Darwin would have had no science to build on. And obviously, when he first introduced his material, there would be several different kinds of reaction. There would be some people who immediately reacted positively to Darwin. Those would be scientists who had already kind of begun to think in terms of uniformitarianism and against catastrophism, which we'll talk about in a minute, and more in terms of some kind of evolutionary change. One of the first to jump on his bandwagon, of course, was the only agnostic in the whole bunch, and that was Thomas Huxley. Some of the other folks were a little bit more hesitant. Thomas Huxley, being an agnostic, had very little at issue, and so he could very easily, just become a born-again evolutionist, a born-again Darwinist, because he was one of those that was in the position of already having given up any real serious meaning in the Christian faith or in the biblical religion. And so there was nothing to fill his soul, so to speak, until Darwin came along with his theory of evolution. On the other hand, somebody like Wallace or Lyell, people like that, were very intelligent, and their work had actually prepared the way for Charles Darwin, but they would not be so anxious to jump on the bandwagon. They would eventually jump on the bandwagon. Well, they didn't jump on the bandwagon. They would eventually go along with the wagon, but it took some time. And there were some people, the older scientists, who were the great scientists, who may have lived their lives and died without going with the wagon. Just like there were some great scientists when Einstein produced the theory of relativity in the 20th century, who lived their lives and died being unable to accommodate themselves to Einstein. After all, if you are a Newtonian, and you've been a Newtonian all your life, and Newtonian physics explains all you need explained in the universe, then what do you need Einstein for? Einstein comes along and tells you that if a ruler is going at the speed of light, it's 6 inches long, or however long it is. You don't need that, If Einstein tells you that if you're going at the speed of light or near the speed of light, time slows down in a very dramatic way, what do you need that for? And if Einstein tells you that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, what do you need that for? Where are you going to go where the shortest distance between 2 points is, a curved line? Where are you going to go where the shortest distance between 2 points is a curved line? You can't go anywhere in this room where the shortest distance between 2 points is a curved line. So there are just lots of people, very good scientists. But science has to do also with human nature and with human brain development. And by the time a scientist is 60 or 70 years old, he's probably not got very much room in his brain to just totally revolutionize his way of looking at things. So there were people like that. There's still people like that in science, and there's still people, for instance, who just hate the idea that their old static equilibrium view of the universe is being rejected by all the young whippersnappers, Nobel Prize winners, and so forth. And so they'll just basically have to die in their old paradigm. But in order for Darwinism to be accepted as generally as it was, and Darwinism was accepted extremely rapidly among Christians. When you compare it, for instance, to the way some sciences were accepted, for instance, in the Soviet Union. In other words, even these old, crusty, traditional Christians were not nearly as obtuse as some of the Soviet scientists who just completely rejected some sciences out of ideological reasons. But as we're going to see also in America, the difference between those, the difference, just take Harvard, the difference between the professor who was pro-Darwin at Harvard and the professor that was anti-Darwin at Harvard was the professor that was pro-Darwin was a conservative Calvinist theologian. The person that was anti-Darwin was a liberal Unitarian. And so those things don't make sense unless you understand the whole context. We're going to talk about that in a minute when we talk about modernist not modernist theology and naturalism. Now, that is a long way around answering your question, but one of the reasons why I take the long way around is because this whole course, in a sense, is going to develop the answers to questions like that. Any other question or response? Darwin's friends, like Lyell, had a struggle to accept some of the implications of Darwinism, because even though Lyell was well able to adjust his interpretation of the Bible to include hundreds of thousands of years, it was a little bit more difficult for him to accommodate his view of the uniqueness of human beings in the scheme of things. And so that would weigh on somebody. It takes a little bit more to revolutionize your understanding of how being human is related to your religion than it does on how old rocks are. Yeah.
Well, also Darwinism just wasn't or his theories weren't just a bolt out of the blue either,
That's right.
I mean, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of other thinking about this subject of change that had, so it's not so unusual that it would be maybe accepted because the ground had been, set, right?
That's right. In fact, it's how interesting it is to speculate about what if. There were two people who were working on a very similar theory of evolution. One was Darwin and the other was Wallace. And Wallace and Darwin published his view in a hurry because he discovered that Wallace was about to publish his view, and there would not have been enough general difference between Wallace's views and Darwin's views, except there was one incredibly important difference. And what was that? Darwin had kind of let his Christian orthodoxy slip. Wallace had not. And so what would have been the difference between if Wallace had gone to the Royal Academy and presented his view, there probably wouldn't have been nearly as much negative reaction to it as there was to Darwin, because Wallace would have slipped in some assurances, to the folks. Well, now you've already accepted Lyell. Lyell has already destroyed a traditional understanding of how old the Earth is. You've already accepted that. You've already accepted uniformitarianism. There were still some catastrophist scientists at the time, but most of them had already begun to accept uniformitarianism. And this is just the next step, to include man within nature and include man within biological processes. But don't fret, because I still believe in God and I still believe in creation and so forth. So it's interesting to speculate if Wallace had gotten his thing out first. But the bottom line still is, Darwin convinced most scientists who were still fairly traditional Christians, and if he hadn't, then he wouldn't have had anybody else to convince because they were the only ones around. The scientific ideas of each, that is, Darwin and Newton. Now he's going to compare Darwin and Newton and how their things influenced. The scientific ideas of each greatly influenced other fields of thought. Each person's work served as a point of departure for the elaboration of a distinctive worldview. And these worldviews, by the way, are in great tension. In order to accept Darwin, you had to be in tension with Newton. And Newton was no slouch. Whether you were an agnostic or a traditional Christian, Newton was still the man. And so in order to accept Darwin, you had to accept a worldview which was in tension with Newton. Newton's was summed up in the image of nature as a mechanism. But Darwin's can be summed up as a dynamic process. Now, most modern Christian theologians wish that Newton had retained more of a dynamic process. But at the same time, they're aware of the fact that that Newton's mechanistic view of the world actually came from some of his theological presuppositions. That is, the passivity of nature and so forth, as opposed to the activity of God. But the argument from design, so common in the writings of Newton and his age, was one of the ideas most seriously called into question by the theory of evolution. Now, if Barber were a naturalist, how would he put that? He would say something like, the argument from design, so common in the writings of Newton and his age, was completely destroyed by Darwin's theory of evolution. And that may be true. But Barber knows that, as a matter of fact, there are some extremely intelligent philosophers who are still trying to rehabilitate the doctrine of design. Paley's particular formulation of it you can probably say that was destroyed. But to limit the argument from design to Paley's particular formulation of it is not a very good way of approaching the study of the history of philosophy or the history of theology, because Paley was not God. He didn't even come close. And he wasn't even a Hegel, who kind of had the idea that after he got through doing philosophy, there wouldn't have to be any other philosophies after him. That wasn't Paley's view. He had a little bit more epistemological humility than that. So I'm sure Paley expected his view of design to be bettered. After all, he believed that he was bettering Newton's view, and Newton believed he was bettering Aquinas's view, and so forth. But they still believed that they were in the same tradition. Well, there are some people who are now in the Paley tradition who would not regurgitate Paley's particular arguments because they know that Darwin has put a crimp in those arguments. So that's the reason why Barber is kind of cautious here. He just says that the argument from design was one of the ideas most seriously called into question by the theory of evolution. And there's no doubt that that's true. It's called into question. Because something called into question does not necessarily mean it's completely destroyed. So if we're going to look at Darwin and natural selection, we have to look at some of the forerunners of Darwin, and we've already talked about some of them. We're going to have to look at Darwin's scientific work, alternate theories of evolution, because Darwin didn't take his theory of evolution into the Royal Society and just win everybody. Even those who already accepted some form of evolution were still looking to other people like Lamarck as their evolutionist theologians. And then, of course, as we say, nature as a dynamic process is a part of Darwin's contribution that has to actually overcome Newton. These older guys have to be overcome if you're going to establish a new worldview. Just like Galileo had to overcome Aristotle, in a sense, Darwin had to go back and overcome Aristotle again in some areas. The theological issues in evolution are first the challenge to Scripture, and the person who handled most of that for Darwin was his bulldog, Thomas Huxley, because Thomas Huxley was a better biblical scholar than Darwin was. Thomas Huxley was well acquainted with more recent biblical interpretation that would have been compatible with the theory of evolution, but was actually produced before any theory of evolution was produced. Now, did you follow that sentence? In other words, scientific creationism is an attempt to react to the theory of evolution with a certain kind of biblical interpretation. But there were already biblical interpretations before Darwin that were quite compatible with evolution, and Thomas Huxley was well aware of those. So if you want to find writing about in which Thomas Huxley actually grapples with biblical interpretation, or if you want to read something where somebody actually grapples with biblical interpretation and theology, don't read Darwin, because he didn't grapple with those anymore. The man who grappled with them was Thomas Huxley, and he liked biblical scholars. He didn't like preachers. And he made a very definite distinction between preachers and biblical scholars. Now, that is sometimes an artificial distinction, since some of the best biblical scholars were also preachers. But it's also true that some of the best-known preachers knew almost nothing about more recent biblical scholarship. And that's who his fight was with. And so he quotes biblical scholars in his fight with preachers. And so this tension was already around, and Thomas Huxley was well aware of it and used it in his bulldog fights with traditionalists. But again, that's somewhat like this traveling salvation show I talked about that Madalyn Murray O'Hair took around the country. In other words, Thomas Huxley loved to fight with religious leaders who do nothing about biblical scholarship, and in that way he was quite an educator. He introduced some biblical scholarship to people who were not aware of it. And I like to read Thomas Huxley because, and I don't like to read. Well, I read what Darwin has to say about theology, but Darwin really didn't keep up with theology or biblical scholarship after he produced his thing. Thomas Huxley did, and a lot of other people did. So there was still something to debate as they went along. So the challenge to Scripture was a challenge that had already been made. The challenge to particular interpretation of Scripture had already been made by biblical scholars, and Huxley and some other people picked up on this. The challenge to design. Now this probably is what is owed to Darwin, because Darwin does produce a worldview which is a challenge to design, and that is the point that all modern Darwinists and neo-Darwinists will make. For instance, that's one of the major points that Stephen Jay Gould will make, is that you can no longer find design in nature. You can no longer find intelligent design in nature. If nature actually progresses as according to Darwin's theory, then there is no need for examining intelligent design. Now that's still a question. That's not something that Darwin settled, whether Gould thinks it is or not. That's still not something that's settled. Something that might be settled in Gould's mind. There may be 1,000 PhDs in whose mind it's not settled. But the challenge to design is where Darwin is most threatening to traditional Christian theology. If you remember one of the points I made very early in the course, and that is there is no argument from design in the Bible. There is no cosmological argument in the Bible. There are no arguments for the existence of God in the Bible. Then you can say that even Darwin's challenge of the design argument is not necessarily a threat to biblical Christianity, but it is a threat to some forms of traditional Christianity. The challenge to the status of humanity, that's where the fear, the anxiety still lies. And that is what keeps scientific creationism alive. Because most scientific creationists, I think, within the next 2 or 3 decades, will become uniformitarianists, like Lyell. Some of them, like Hugh Ross, who is one of the more famous creationists around, he's an astronomer, is already involved in an educational crusade to try to clean up scientific creationism, because he has his view is that the universe is 14 or 15 billion years old, and that the Earth is however many millions of years old the latest date is, and he also believes that human beings. He also accepts any date that scientists want to put on the rise of human beings as we know them. And the date that scientists are putting on the rise of human beings as we know them is not a very old date. You're talking about 20 to 40,000 or 80,000 years at the most. Human beings as we know them, because from Hugh Ross's perspective, that's all you have to do when you're reading the Bible, because the Bible was not written for Neanderthal man. The Bible was written for human beings as we know them. And even the Bible makes it clear that throughout most of the history of mankind, there was not a Bible. That the Bible only comes into existence in the last 3,000 years. And so Hugh Ross then is able to accept almost anything that an evolutionary scientist says about nature, except he believes in the uniqueness of human nature so strongly that he believes unless there was some kind of miraculous intervention to make human beings as we know them today, unique human beings with human souls, then he can't go any farther than that. So here you have, for instance, in Hugh Ross, who's by the way not the only one, but the major creationist who is on these Christian TV networks, and he certainly doesn't believe the same thing about science that the people who put him on believe. But he is so persuasive that they at least give him the platform to explain his viewpoints. So that again is a debate going on, not even more particularly, not just among Christians, but among Christians who were raised in a creation science tradition. So but the challenge to the status of humanity is still the most threatening thing for creation scientists, whether they believe the earth is old or whether they believe the earth is new. There still has to be some concept of divine intervention to produce human beings. Now, that's the same with Roman Catholic theologians. There are many more Roman Catholic theologians and Bible scholars who have accommodated to the theory of evolution than there are Protestants, though the majority of both have done that. There's still, ironically, a larger number of Roman Catholic theologians and Bible scholars have accommodated to Darwinianism. But they still have this problem of the status of humanity. And so the general Catholic view is that everything an evolutionist discovers about the history of mankind, the history of human beings, can be completely accepted by a Catholic scholar. In fact, that was the main point of the Pope's last declaration that came out of the Vatican on the teaching of evolution in Catholic schools, because there's certainly more Catholic schools who teach the theory of evolution than there are Protestant Christian schools. And what he said, which still amazes lots of Catholics when they hear it, is that the teaching of evolution is not incompatible with Catholic doctrine. There's only one little hitch, and that is somewhere in that timeline, there has to be a miraculous intervention where something that was not human miraculously became human. And that is usually symbolized by the idea that an eternal soul was created and inserted in a human being. And so the human being who became a human being may have 5 minutes before looked exactly the same as he did 5 minutes later, but the major difference is what? He now has an eternal soul. And that is what Catholics call creationism. The creation of the eternal soul. As far as the way the species developed, they have no problem, as long as you allow God at some point in the process to insert a human soul. Now, Protestant theologians are not creationists even in that sense, because they don't believe that is what constitutes the difference between an animal that is not human and an animal that is human. That is the insertion of an immortal soul, because they have more of a unified conception of the human being. And so there had to be a time, from the perspective of Protestant evolutionists, there had to be a time when what was not human became human. But they believe even that was a natural process. See the difference between Catholic creationism and the Protestant doctrine. In other words, Barber does not believe that in order for a person to become human, there had to be a miraculous insertion of a human soul into an animal that was not human. Barber believes that there has been a long evolutionary process in which humans have come into being, but they came into being by a natural process, just like they began by a natural process. Now, when you pinpoint that is a matter of disagreement, possibly. Yeah.
I'm not sure if we can get into this, but didn't at one point it was discussed that even the concept of the soul is a kind of a non-biblical or non-Judaic tradition?
Yeah. Well,
seems like it'd be easy to drift away from that too.
Yes. That's basically what Barber argues. He doesn't argue that the concept of the soul is not biblical. What he argues is that the Aristotelian concept of the soul is not biblical, or the Platonic concept. And Catholic scholars are still wedded to Platonic and Aristotelian ideas, because Catholic scholars have a different conception of religious authority from Protestant scholars. Protestant scholars even though both Protestants and Catholics have a view of the relationship between tradition and Scripture, Catholics tend to elevate the authority of tradition more than Protestants do. Protestants tend to elevate the authority of Scripture more than Catholics do. Now, they may disagree with that. They may say that they have the authority in balance. which I'm sure is what they would say. But that means that for Barber, when he comes to trying to figure out what a human being is, he doesn't have to refer to Aristotle or to Plato or to any of these other doctrines of the soul, because from his perspective, the doctrine of the soul in the Bible is a Hebrew concept, not a Greek concept. And so the word soul in the Bible does not refer to an immortal substance that is inserted in a human being. The key word there is substance. Where does the word substance come from in Catholic theology? From Aristotle. Even when you're studying, for instance, the Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist, what is the name that is philosophical name that is usually used to describe the Catholic doctrine of the change that takes place in the bread and the wine during the Eucharist? What's the word? Transubstantiation. In other words, what happens in a Mass is described in Catholic theology, maybe now less so than before, but is traditionally been described in Catholic theology in Aristotelian terms. How do you interpret when Jesus says at the Last Supper, "This is my body," referring to the bread, "this is my blood," referring to the wine? Well, a Jew or a Protestant would just say, that's what he said. This is my blood, this is my body. But if you're a philosopher, you want to try to explain it in some philosophically explicable way. And the way this was done in the Middle Ages was through the Aristotelian doctrine of substance and accidents. That is, what happens when the time comes in the Mass for the bread to actually become the body of Christ is that the accidents of the bread remain the same, which means what? It still looks, smells, tastes like bread. Those are the accidents. But from Aristotle's perspective, there is more than accidents in a bread. There is substance. There is bread substance. So, according to the traditional Catholic doctrine, which again is something that's being questioned in terms of its language, even in the Catholic Church, but according to the traditional Catholic doctrine, what changes is not the accidents. Any fool can see that the accidents are the same. What changes is the substance. That is, the substance of the bread, the substance of the body of Christ is substituted in the bread for the substance bread. And that's the miracle that occurs. Well, if that's the miracle that occurs, fine. Except all I'm pointing out is that language is Aristotelian. That's the way you have to explain the miracle that takes place in the Mass if you're going to explain it in Aristotelian terms. Now, Protestants don't explain it in Aristotelian terms. Generally, what Protestants do is to allow the words to maintain their mystery. And so when Baptists say, "This is my body," they may have a slightly different understanding of what that means than when a Church of Christ or a Methodist or a Lutheran says, "This is my body." But they don't use the Aristotelian language. They just go more toward mystery, which is a good place to go when you're talking about theology. You go to a little mystery, and that gets you away from having to explain everything philosophically. Okay, substance then is an important thing, because in medieval Catholic doctrine, substance is what changes in the Lord's Supper. Grace is a substance that is infused. Whereas in Protestant theology, grace is not a substance that is infused into a person. Kind of like, well, I won't use that illustration. But substance is not something that's infused in a person, and then on the basis of that infusion, that fuel, a person acts as though he's been graced. Grace in Protestantism is more pictured like the human being is bound and grace unbinds him. So you see the difference between grace as a unbinding and grace as an infusion. All right, in the same way, Protestantism and from their perspective, biblical thought thinks of the soul not as something that is not something immortal that is infused in a human being that makes him human, but the soul itself is a part of the creation of a human being. It's part of, in other words, the human being is created as a unity: body, soul, spirit, guts, kidneys, whatever else you want to use. The human being is created as a unity, and this helps you to interpret the scriptures a little bit more easily. For instance, in Genesis, which we've read, and you now know all about it, it says, doesn't it, God formed man from the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and gave him an immortal soul. Is that what it says? What does it say? God formed man from the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living soul. So the point is not that Protestants don't have a doctrine of the soul. The point is that Protestants have a different doctrine of the soul from Roman Catholics. The soul is understood as a part of the creation of the unified human being. So, if human beings are created instantaneously, or if they develop over millions of years, the result is exactly the same. A human being is a living soul that has been inbreathed by God. He's the creation of God. He's made in the image of God. And so the biblical picture of what a human being is actually closer dynamically to the scientific picture of what a human being is. I used to hear preachers, and they're still preachers, for instance, say things like, these scientists believe that human beings were made from slime. And they always say slime like that. You can't just say slime. They have to say slime, just like they say sex. But anyway, human beings are made from slime. Well, what is that? That's a pejorative way of talking about it, and it's also a statement which goes askew of the it's also a violation of the genetic fallacy. Suppose human beings do come from slime. What does the genetic fallacy say? Just because human beings come from slime does not mean that when you talk about a human being, you're talking about slime. That's the genetic fallacy. And so the fact of the matter is that that's exactly what Genesis 2 says. It's not making a scientific statement. It's just making a common ordinary observation that human beings come from slime. How would they know that? Well, because when human beings die, what do they become? When a human being dies, he becomes dust. So you don't have to be a scientist to know that human beings are made out of dust. You just have to have eyeballs and be able to notice what happens when a person dies. So when Genesis 2 says that human beings are made from dust, they didn't have to have a direct revelation from God to know that. All they had to do was just observe. So Genesis 2 mostly is just saying what any ordinary person can observe. The only unique thing about Genesis 1 and 2 is that it's saying this human being was made from dust by God. And this human being who was made from dust by God was told by God, according to chapter 2, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you will die. So the human being in Genesis 2 is a mortal being, just like all other animals. He can only be immortal if there is some kind of transformation that takes place through his eating of the tree of life. That's why the tree of life is there. If human beings were created as immortal souls, there wouldn't be any need for a tree of life. And there certainly wouldn't be any threat in saying you're going to die, because an immortal soul does not die. So what I'm saying is that if we actually read the text in a very conservative way, then there are not nearly as many obstacles. It doesn't give us modern science, but there are not near as many obstacles to modern science if you read the text in a conservative way. And I tell my students in my lower courses, and since you probably haven't done this yourself, I'll tell you, go to your dictionary, any dictionary, look up the word slime. And what is the first definition of slime? The first definition of slime is dirt mixed with water. It's wet dirt. That's the first definition of slime. The second definitions get a little bit more gross, you know. But the point is that from the biblical perspective, nobody who is a Christian or a Jew should use the word slime as if it meant something bad. I have a friend, and I hope she doesn't watch this show. I have a friend who went to church one morning. She was pregnant, and her water broke in the vestibule of the church. Now, that was an embarrassing situation for that woman, because there she was standing in a puddle of slime. But anyone who is a Christian or a Jew knows that there's nothing evil or low about slime. It is the context of life. It's the context of life. And though it may be a little messy to watch a human birth, the slime that is involved in the human birth, there's nothing evil about it. Am I making my connection here with the nature of man from the biblical perspective? What I'm saying is that the nature of man from the biblical perspective does not arise out of a scientific analysis of a human being, but it is perfectly compatible with a scientific understanding of a human being. And it's only a Platonist who would consider slime to be evil. A Christian may not consider slime to be cute, but he doesn't consider it to be evil. He considers it to be the creation of God. Slime is the creation of God. It's the context in which life arises. So it's no argument then. There may be some good arguments against evolution, but one of them is not that human beings came from slime, because that's the biblical view. Let's see, did I get over that? Another challenge, of course, theological issue that rises is evolutionary ethics and social Darwinism. And Thomas Huxley also deals very well with that issue, because Thomas Huxley disagreed totally. Well, I probably ought to say Julian Huxley, his grandson, disagreed totally with Thomas Huxley, because Julian Huxley at the 1959 Darwin Centennial in Chicago read a paper in which he was trying to establish ethics on the basis of Darwinianism. That was anathema to Thomas. Thomas understood that you cannot establish an ethic on Darwinism that will keep human beings superior to any animal. How can you base ethics on Darwinism? That's social Darwinism. Thomas Huxley said that, in fact, human ethics are a continual affront to nature. And so so Thomas Huxley in fact was arguing that people in the future should not base their ethics on Darwin. That's not what you base your ethics on. Ethics, in fact, should be in opposition to Darwinism. Now, there are more recent Darwinists who are trying to develop a Darwinian ethic. And however successful they be, I don't know. But that certainly wasn't Thomas Huxley's view. Thomas Huxley and Charles Darwin were Victorians. Their morals were Victorian morals. They believed that you ought to be a Victorian gentleman and women ought to be Victorian ladies. And they believed that you ought to treat people like Victorians are supposed to treat people. And but they believed that this was a hard-won position that was won in the struggle with nature. It's not a position that arises out of nature. Bronowski, the mathematician who I've made reference to, for instance, in his book on the rise of civilization, I also saw the film based on this book, and in the last part of the film, Bronowski is standing in a mud puddle. Now, this is a horrible mud puddle because it contains the ashes of his parents and some of his kinfolk, because it was outside of a concentration camp where the burned ashes of people were scattered. And so he was up to his knees in this slime, in this mud. That part of it was made up of his own family, and this was the part of the book where he was going to tell us what the basis for his ethic was. And his basic for his ethic was Heisenberg. That is, Heisenberg tells us about tolerance. Now, take that in. Heisenberg tells us about tolerance. Well, do you know anything about Heisenberg and tolerance? Heisenberg is talking about tolerance in a physical sense. That is, that the universe, that the physical universe is a little bit more tolerant than determinists had visioned it before. And so what he says is that since Heisenberg has established that tolerance is in the very makeup of the smallest level of the universe, then that means we should all be tolerant of each other. What's the problem with that? That's just a confusion of language. That's an equivocation on language. Because Heisenberg couldn't possibly have meant by tolerance what you needed to do in order to tolerate Jews. Those are two different levels of thought. But that's what happens when Julian Huxley and Bronowski, who do not have any concept that ethics might arise out of anything but science, and science is basically God. That's the way they justify their tolerance. Well, I agree with Bronowski that we ought to be tolerant, but you're not going to make people tolerant by reading Heisenberg to them. And you're not going to make people tolerant by reading Julian Huxley to them. You might make them tolerant by reading Thomas Huxley, because Thomas Huxley understood that you can't derive ethics from science.
What did he think you should derive ethics from?
It was the result of a long human struggle toward civilization and so forth. In other words, it was a struggle against our natural tendencies. The natural tendency is the survival of the fittest. The natural tendency is red in tooth and claw. So that's the reason why Thomas Huxley was also such a proponent of social Darwinism because he thought that we had already, in fact, he attributed a lot of this to religion. Judaism and Christianity had produced a situation where as human beings, we were above the survival of the fittest. And so, I don't know how profound you can describe Thomas Huxley's ethics, but it certainly wasn't the same as what is now being developed by Darwinists, as if you can get a human ethic out of science. Now, there are diverging currents in theology in the 19th century that are important to look at. They're the traditional responses to evolution, but then there's the modernist movement. And the word modernist implies, every age considers itself to be the modern age. If you read a book written in the 20s, or then these people are modern people. Now, when we look back at them, we don't think of them very modern. We think of ourselves as modern people. Well, so modern, the view that we were modern lasted quite a while, but now even modernists are tired of that term, so they're going to postmodernism. And postmodernism, the problem is that I guess what's next is going to be postmodernism, and then postmodernism, and so forth. But modernism is just a state of mind, so to speak, that generally assumes that we finally arrived. We now know that we haven't finally arrived. Unless we blow ourselves up, then we finally arrived. But we haven't finally arrived, and that there's going to be human thinking and human scientific endeavors on for however many centuries or millions of years human beings last. So what does modernism mean? That's one of the questions that postmodernism raises. But the modernist movement generally had the tendency to accept science as the basis for the theory of evolution, in fact, specifically as the basis for understanding history, understanding philosophy, understanding ethics, understanding theology. Then there's the rise of liberal theology, which is not necessarily modernistic, but it attempts to interpret Christian theology in the light of modern thought. But it doesn't just transform Christian theology into modern thought. And then there are the naturalistic philosophies of evolution, and the modernist movement in Christianity tended to end up basically with a naturalistic philosophy of evolution. Okay, we've talked about the forerunners of Darwin: Charles Lyell, Carl Linnaeus, and Buffon. Linnaeus made the famous charts of plant life that were the basic scientific way of differentiating and classifying plant life. Buffon did the same thing for animal life. And these people were Aristotelian kind of creationists. In other words, they believed that things were fixed, species were fixed, and if they weren't fixed, they could only move a slight distance one way or the other. Lamarck was one who had a scientific theory of evolution, which was based on habit. Habit becomes the basis for change, and then that change is inherited. So the giraffe gets a long neck because it has to stretch it to reach something, and if he stretches it long enough, then his son or his descendant inherits that. And Lamarckianism was one of the philosophical views that a lot of people latched onto, even before Darwin. And then there's William Paley, who is especially important as a forerunner of Darwin. because Darwin studied William Paley in college, and William Paley was the man who developed the classical argument from design. And analysts of Darwin's work point out that Darwin argues and thinks very much in a Paley tradition, even though his arguments actually undermine Paley's doctrine of a design. You can tell that he studied under Paley. Science in the 19th century included several different perspectives that Darwin challenged. One was catastrophism, which is basically the idea that all of the geological strata and all of the geological formations in the world were the result of catastrophes that occurred, and the major catastrophe was the flood of Noah. And the scientific theory that challenged this, of course, was the theory of uniformitarianism. That is, that all of the geological strata are the result of millions of years of formation by ordinary laws of nature, and that you do not have to go to catastrophic explanation. It's interesting that there are now some people who are going back to catastrophic explanations about a great many things, but who are not going back necessarily to Noah's flood, but they just like Gould has gone to punctuated equilibrium instead of a gradual uniformitarianism. But anyway, these were the opposites in the 19th century: catastrophism and uniformitarianism. But also in the 19th century, there was still, among good scientists, the view in the fixity of the species and the stability of biological forms. Now, sometimes creation scientists use these same expressions. The fixity of the species. Now, what do you know about the fixity of the species? Again, this expression. What you know is that you're again using Aristotelian language. And so, in a sense, what Darwin has to do to overcome the Christian traditionalist of his day is to further undermine the influence of Aristotle. Because the Bible doesn't say anything about species. The Bible doesn't say anything about the fixity of species. And so if a Christian goes around saying the Bible teaches the fixity of the species, he's not a very conservative Bible interpreter, because those expressions are not found in the Bible. What he is he is a carrier of the Aristotelian tradition. So belief in the stability of biological forms was in part a corollary of the conviction that each type of being was created by God in its present form, as depicted in Genesis. It was, in some measure, a legacy of the Aristotelian doctrine that all individual beings are embodiments of eternal forms or unchanging essences or substances. So see, when Darwin fights some Christian thinkers, he doesn't just have to fight the Bible, because the Bible doesn't discuss these subjects. He has to fight Aristotle. So even if the people who are fighting Darwin have never even read Aristotle and don't know what Aristotle taught, when the language they're using is Aristotelian language, just like the people were doing at the time of Galileo. Classically, the goals of each organism and the final causes of its activity were taken as the primary explanation of its structure. That's the teleological view of nature. And that is that there are final causes which actually push or pull nature in its development. And these are things that modern Darwinists hate with a passion. Anyone who tries to insert teleological explanations or final causes into the theory of evolution, because from their perspective that's going back to theology. And it is going back to theology. But it's not necessarily going back to biblical theology, it's going back to theology which was still heavily influenced by Aristotle. Thus Darwin can be said to have dealt the death blow to Aristotelian biology as Newton did to Aristotelian physics. See what's happening here? We're talking about a battle between Christianity and science, and what we're actually dealing with is a battle between Aristotle and science. In the period before Darwin, some theologians saw in the new geology a threat to biblical authority, but most did not. The only ones we've heard of lately are those who did. But most Christian theologians did not see the new geology as a threat to biblical authority, because they were able to read the Bible in such a way that whatever Charles Lyell found out about geology was not in contradiction. Biblical literalism had long since been questioned before Darwin. One of the most modernist liberal theologians who impacted the whole history of modern Christian theology did his work before Darwin. The status of humanity was not diminished by a longer time span. What difference does it make how long human beings have been here? They're still human beings. You know, that again, that refers to the genetic fallacy. And I like to illustrate it in another way, which I don't see illustrated very often. But the Christian doctrine of creation is not only that Adam was created, but that Scott Borland was created. And Scott Borland used to be a tiny one-celled animal. You could have taken him and put him under a microscope, and he would have been a hairy little booger. But that it is a genetic fallacy to say that since Scott Borland came from this ugly-looking little one-celled animal, that therefore he is not the result of the creation of God, because the doctrine of the creation of God is a different level of discourse. And if you can understand that in the case of one individual, then you should be able to understand it in the case of the whole species. In other words, there is no theological objection to a human being being created and being brought into maturity from a one-celled animal. There can't be a theological objection to that, because even scientific creationists know that happens every time a person is born. So there must be some other objection to it besides the theological one. So the status of humanity is not diminished by there being a longer history of his development. He's still a human being. When you meet a human being on the road, you may not know how long his species has been around, but that doesn't change what he is. And that goes back to this question of the anxiety about how any theory of science might affect the status of man, the status of a human being. The human being is still whatever he is, whatever his history is. He's still what he is. Does that make sense? If each species was endowed with its present form at the time it was created, and if humankind was a special creation by God, human uniqueness was protected, according to some people. The argument from design, in fact, still enjoyed great popularity despite the criticism by Hume and Kant. Exponents of natural theology in the early 19th century were confident in their ability to discover the beneficent plan of God's wisdom within the biological order. And that brings us to Paley's natural theology. And that was a required text in Darwin's university education. So Darwin himself is in reaction to a theological perspective. So it's not, Darwin's whole view does not just fall out of heaven from nowhere. He's already in a discussion. And the discussion goes on without Darwin. In fact, it goes on without Darwin's participation, which is an unfortunate fact of Darwin's later life. Okay, we're going to have to kind of wind up there and talk some more next time about Darwin's scientific work. Anybody want the last word or the last question? You've got about 10 seconds to do it. Otherwise, we're just going to continue next time.